So, in the month of May, I read 12 transformative novels, and today I'm going to tell you guys about every single one of them. And my name is Ian, and here on Right Conscious, we talk about the best authors and books in the world. And all the books I'm going to be talking about today, I think at least, are on that list. And so, I'm not going to play hide the cookie with you. One of the first books I read in May is The Boogeyman of Western literature, of course, Lolita. And there are so many people triggered by this book right now because everyone has an opinion on this book, but many people have not actually read Lolita because, yes, people are triggered right now because it deals with one of the most immoral things ever: pedophilia, the exploitation of children in a sexual manner. But what makes Lolita so great and so important, and why every single person right now, if you haven't read it, needs to go buy it, is the voice of the novel. It is better or on par with Moby Dick, As I Lay Dying, Catcher in the Rye, or any other novel where the voice is just screaming through. The voice and the framing of Lolita is so unique, so genius, so innovative, because what it's doing, or I should say what Nabokov is doing, is breaking the fourth wall. He is trying to stylize one of the most immoral things in the world to show us how art and our worship of artists blurs our boundaries, because the novel is framed through, and I should say really fast that I'm not going to spoil anything about any of the books we're going to talk about today that you can't read on the Amazon description. I may mention some random event in the story that doesn't really matter. So you guys are safe here. But in the forward of Lolita, we have Dr. John Ray, who's this psychoanalyst looking at Humbert Humbert's memoir, and he's been enchanted and seduced. And the writing is so beautiful, so stylized, so convincing by Nabokov that it's not like you sit there and you accept pedophilia, but there are moments where you're getting pulled into the story. And there's nothing very overt or like crazy sex scenes or anything like that. But the way he writes and the way we see the voice of Humbert shining through is a grade A example of manipulation, of toxicity, of how we all reframe things and how other people reframe certain situations to make it look better. And probably through half of the novel, we live in that fantasy land. Then slowly there are breaks in it, and it's beautiful to watch. It's beautiful to watch the collapse of the fantasy. And this brings up another really good point, which is this idea that so many bros online like to say, I can separate the art from the artist. And that is 100% impossible unless you are just purely detaching from the work. Because let's say you lived in a small town and there was a store 5 minutes from your house that you went to get groceries or some other stuff. And then there was another one 15 minutes away. And these are like small stores. But let's say you figured out that the owner of the store, the guy behind the counter, was a convicted child rapist, a Nazi, and like 5 other things that we all deem bad. Many of us would say, you know what? I'm not going to support this guy. I'm going to drive down the road. And many others will say, you know what? I don't care. And the same is true with corporations. Like, corporations don't really care who they're taking their money from. But in general, if you have a moral compass, you will reject that person. But there are others who may be poor, or maybe because of other reasons, who will blur their morality, create a story, and still take their children to the store to get lollipops from the dude because it's closer and he's got better prices. But what's funny is that a lot of us do the same thing with our favorite artists, that we've been enchanted by their stylization of things. And when we talk about some of their more malignant aspects, and this is something that I've done before and why I try to talk about the negative aspects of authors without canceling them and acting like an idiot on this channel. But many of us, because of our relationship, having spent sometimes dozens of hours reading a certain author, it's easy for us to gloss over some of the maybe terrible things that they did. And Nabokov's poking fun at that, showing how style and art can basically let you get away with more than you think. And because we live in this society, in this age that loves to psychoanalyze, I don't know if you've ever been around people or if you've done this yourself and you're like, well, what's wrong with Johnny? You think about it and you use psychology buzzwords. When you enter that world, then you actually enter a world where you yourself can be manipulated. Because I've been in a relationship before, and shocker, right? I'm now married, but in one of my previous relationships, my ex-girlfriend would, when a problem would come up or like some of her really bad aspects that led to us eventually breaking up, she'd say, well, this happened when I was young. But looking back, she knew all the psychological buzzwords and was using them and creating the perfect Freudian or psychological narrative so that she didn't actually have to do any work. And that's exactly what's happening in this story. Humbert is the perfect Freudian case study, the perfect person to examine in a very neutral way when we shouldn't be examining him neutrally. We should be emotionally triggered by him. And like I said, this is something that happens in our personal relationships now that can be blurred because of the hormones created by sex. It can happen with our family because they're our family. It can happen at work because of money. I mean, there are many different things. But one of the ways to be a conscious human being is to see people for who they actually are and view them that way. And so that is why Lolita is a great novel. It is just a force of style that can make you overlook for the slightest moment or pull you in deeper than you think to some of the crazy stuff. So next I read The Death of Ivan Ilich by Leo Tolstoy. And all the books I'm going to be talking about today were read in the Right Conscious Book Club, which is the most active book club in the world. We read anywhere from 8 to 12 novels per month and meet on them. I make content on a lot of the books. On the screen right now are the books we are going to be reading in June. We're going to continue reading Tolstoy books and Hemingway books, Mishima, Don DeLillo, David Foster Wallace, Dostoevsky, Pynchon, Cormac McCarthy, Nabokov. You guys can pause this really fast if you guys want to look at it. But The Death of Ivan Ilich is a great introduction to Tolstoy. And over the next, I don't even know how long, we're going to be reading through all of Tolstoy's at least major works. And what I love about this novel, once again, is the framing. We have death at the front. And this is a very fast read. If you haven't read this, this will take you 90 minutes at most to kind of blow through or contemplate slowly. And by having a death of someone, Ivan Ilich, at 45, what it does is increase the pacing of the novel. Kashiro Ishiguro, the Nobel Prize winner, does this in his novel Never Let Me Go really well. I've heard him talk about it before, that he has these very bleak atheistic views toward reality, that we're just, heading toward nothingness, and that we kind of like in an Ernest Becker way create these immortality projects and try to deny death by various means, and that he believes by being an atheist that he can confront these things faster. And so instead of having a story about a bunch of old people dying, he was like, wait, what if I created a dystopic reality where people are dying in their early 20s? Modern individuals who are going to private schools and these things, and they have these slow, painful deaths. That will bring these ideas of bleakness and nothingness after death to the forefront of my novel. And because it's happening fast, because it's coming, which is the same in Ivan Ilich, who dies at 45, it's actually a really good framing device to speed things up. Mishima does something very similar in his novels. He realized that people dying at the end of their life is sad, but really not that sad. But when a young person dies, it's tragic. The idealism they have in their heart also crashes down into kind of our emotional sphere and activates us. So The Death of Ivan Ilich plays with that, but obviously Tolstoy has a much more redemptive and Christian lens, even though he doesn't really mention or evoke too much of Christianity in this one, toward reality. And that's why Tolstoy is great in general. Same with Dostoevsky, especially a lot of his later work, is that there is hope in it. Kind of one of the problems with 20th century art in general, even though I'm a big fan of it, most of this bookshelf is 20th century novels, is that it can be very bleak. It can be psychotic and tap into kind of the neurosis that we fell into. We had 2 world wars. We had hundreds of millions of other deaths outside of, the world wars because of democide, death by government. There was so much trauma. Obviously, we pulled ourselves out of illiteracy in many parts of the world, pulled ourselves up into these middle-class, technological, suburban states. And it hasn't been the most perfect project in terms of our mental health and how we view reality. And so guys like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and even Nietzsche are awesome because they are right before that cusp. They could see the modern world coming, that you listen to their predictions about what was going to happen over the next 50, 60 years in their conception, and they were right, basically. But they still had enough of the old world in them. They were born in the earlier stages of the 19th century. And so they still have that old world wisdom. They hadn't seen the world war. They hadn't been exposed to modernism and postmodernism or whatever yet. And many of them had at least connections to something spiritual. And what makes Tolstoy great is that, in the 19th century Russian culture had rejected a lot of the tenets of orthodoxy or just weren't like practicing them. And Tolstoy kind of came back. And, I'd like to see that in an author. I like to see an author who was raised Christian or, raised atheist, and then find a more redemptive or polarizing path later on, because then they can play with paradoxes. They can view the problem in different ways. And that's what's kind of happening in the death of Ivan Ilich. We have this man who's dying, it's the death of him, and we kind of slowly see it happen. And we get a beautiful experience of the rigid and secular side of reality. Then we get to kind of dive into the non-secular stuff. And so I would recommend this book to everyone. I'm sure many of you guys have read that, but we did read that with the book club. Right now, I'm really trying to set like foundational works down for later. I'm trying to get all these big books out of the way that I feel like are important for new readers. If you're a new reader out there, these are the things you need to be reading, to set, I don't believe in gatekeeping, but I like to set myself up when I, for instance, read War and Peace or another Tolstoy novel that's lengthier and more complex with some of their easier work, so I can get into the mentality, understand the historical and the style aspects, and then I have a higher chance of getting through their work. And that's what I'm trying to help my members do, because that's my job, motivating you guys to read literature. And so next on the list, speaking of foundational works, and I should note that over on the Right Conscious Substack, I have an hour breakdown of both The Death of Ivan Ilich and Siddhartha up right now. So I also reread Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. And I first read this when I was like 13 years old, and this was one of the big red pills for me, because many of us in Western society still have not been exposed to Eastern ideas. Maybe we've been to yoga class, but we still haven't, dived too deep into Buddhism, Hinduism, yoga, and the varying sects of those. And I truly do believe that for the Western mind, the East is one of the perfect counterbalances. And I would say the same about the East, needing the West, that you don't need to, grow your hair long, put on the beads, and go to Bali to a retreat. But that Eastern modalities of thought will help you be able to express and explore your emotional, philosophical, and present moment ontology of phenomenology existence much better. And they will kind of refresh the kind of drudgery of the complexity of Western philosophy and the bleakness and many of these things. And that's what Siddhartha is about. It's a odd retelling, but not retelling, of the Buddha's journey and the path of and a path of individuation in an Eastern context. Because many of us, depending on what sect of Christianity you're in or not at all, our path is redemptive, or we're trying to get to heaven, trying to live this moral life. But in Siddhartha and in the East, it's more of a journey of achieving unity and oneness, stopping the wheel of dharma and karma. And so this is an easy read, once again, and one that you can finish in a couple hours. And everyone who read it for the book club, maybe minus one person, from what I remember, loved it. Thought that it really kind of exposed them to this new world. Because many times when we're reading Eastern authors, we're reading something dealing like Mumbai or New Delhi in 20th century coming of age novel of a girl who's not respected by her parents, or we're reading some Murakami novel about some weird dude that wants to sleep with his sister, or we're reading Musashi about Japan. But there aren't many books about the East that Westerners read that actually deal with kind of the spiritual nature of it. And Hermann Hesse was a German. He's not some Eastern mystic. And so this is just kind of like a gateway book to deeper ones. But I think it is important to kind of reattune or attune the mind, depending on if you're reading it or rereading it for the first time, and seeing the actual goal, seeing the pathway of individuation from a different perspective. Because I have a yoga channel, if you guys don't know, it's called Yogadelics. I'll link that down below if I remember. And over there, I'm very critical of yoga. And I also kind of am redefining yoga. And my new definition of yoga is, instead of like to yoke or the classic definition, it is the creation and the flow of energy, learning to create energy and make energy flow, which is, I think, what encompasses the Eastern modalities of spirituality in like a sentence. And if you learn to do that, and then you combine that with the one sentence blurb about Western spirituality, which is the use and management of that energy. If you look at Western spirituality, it's really focused on, like, first of all, deep philosophical ruminations, but like using and managing energy. If you look at Rosicrucianism and Western occultism and the Grail myth and Beowulf and the hero kind of saga that has been present even until today's culture. It's very much about being action oriented. And when you look at thinkers like Carl Jung, a lot of what he figured out with his therapy was that we need to be healed through active imagination. That Jung would say that a Westerner, doing meditation or yoga is kind of a bad idea and somewhat useless because we were raised differently. And our path to healing is through active imagination and through more active modalities and not renunciation. And so I think that in our modern context, because we're more hybrid beings and have actually had Eastern thought installed in many ways into our brain without even realizing it, just through popular culture, music, media, influencers, that we may be one of the first generations in history that can actually combine those two and become proficient in both. And so this novel is a good exploration of this kind of general idea of learning how to create and make energy flow in the body, mind, and spirit. And so I would recommend this one. Next on the list, and this one is for all of my lit bros out there, of course, is Notes from the Underground, everybody. And this was a really fun book club. I also did a course video on this one where I kind of look at this novel from the point of creativity and how the underground man is like many creatives I know, many of the commenters I know, and people who are creatively stunted and, from resentment, from logic, from many of these things. And, that's kind of one of the core aspects of this novel that Dostoevsky, and we're reading Dostoevsky's entire bibliography right now and his biography, the beautiful biography by Joseph Frank. We also just read Crime and Punishment this month. We're reading The Gambler in June, which is also going to be heavily focused on addiction. But Notes from the Underground was written in such a bleak and hard time of Dostoevsky's life. He had been raised in a lower nobility, or I should say lower upper class type of way. Obviously, his father died. He achieved literary fame. You guys all know the story, sent to Siberian exile. But the year that he wrote this, his first wife and his brother both died. And he was in debt and gambling. And it takes someone at that level, a man of paradox, to be able to write this. This is an exploration and a prophetic vision of what many of us are going to become in a very extreme way. I think Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this video, is somewhat of a better example of how, modern men and young men kind of act, and it's a little bit more prophetic. But this one's prophetic for the people who are really down and out, people who've been consumed totally by logic, totally by inaction, are stuck in resentment and many of these negative cycles. And that's what I hope by reading this, if you haven't read it yet, or if you reread it, that you can heal, that you can look at this through, that how resentment kills you. And, and for me, I've rereading this, I've looked at people in my life, extended family or whoever, friends who have resentment, who have underground man qualities. And it's so sad. It's so sad to see people stuck in this paralysis. And as I was saying earlier, this novel is kind of the height of Dostoevsky's bleakness in terms of his potential. If we go back earlier in his career with like The Double or Poor Folk, that's him kind of flexing a lot of his childhood and early life problems, but also showing his like talent and his ambition. So there's that element to him, as every author carries along their youth and their first books with them throughout their career. But then Notes from the Underground is kind of the pinnacle of this dark side that we see later in many of Dostoevsky's really transformative novels, The Brothers K, Crime and Punishment, and Demons, when he really started to tap in more to the redemptive and orthodoxy side of his consciousness. So you can't get a lot of Dostoevsky's great works without this middle part, without this paradoxical darkness. And so, like I said, I'm sure many of you guys have read this before, but if you haven't, I absolutely recommend it. It is only like 150 pages. There are honestly some good scenes, some good characters, and a lot to contemplate. So next up, we have the Japanese Dostoevsky, Yukio Mishima. And Mishima's Sea of Fertility tetralogy, especially the first book, but maybe in some of the subsequent ones, are really kind of like Dostoevsky embodied in Japan. Many people know Mishima because of his radical politics or Sun and Steel, all the video essays and video edits out there. But many people don't realize that he is a very, very good novelist. That's how he became a celebrity. That's why people still talk about him and take him seriously. My channel has mostly talked about a lot of his personal opinions, but I also have a lot of content on his fiction, and we're working our way through all of his fiction in the book club. And so The Decay of the Angel, which is the conclusion of the tetralogy, is really about obsession. It's really Mishima working through a lot of the paradoxes and ideas, bleakness versus life, life and death, reincarnation versus nothingness, really working through a lot of the stuff that he's been programmed with, because Mishima watched, and grew up in Imperial Japan. He received a wristwatch from the emperor for like being the valedictorian. He barely missed out on World War II. And because he loved that Japan so much, what he saw with not just, or I should say it like this, Mishima saw that the Japan who got led into World War II was moving away from a lot of its early principles, that it got roped into imperialism. And in the first couple novels, he really explores how, the first two novels, I should say, how Western culture influenced Japan for the negative. And both novels take place before World War II. And so Mishima saw those elements, but he also understood there were things such as Buddhism, which were implanted into Japan, that were also ruining the culture, confusing the culture. And so the last two books of the series are following along a character from the first books, but are really starting to explore obsession, death, and this idea of God and the afterlife from a Japanese context. And Mishima does a great job of like sending his characters through the methods earlier, as I said, of individuation that should lead you to some form of relief, but they do not. And so that's kind of the linchpin of the novel that drives the plot, this idea of reincarnation. Because the loose plot of all four novels is that there is someone who is reincarnating, and this one character who starts off as a boy is following these different reincarnations and trying to make sense of it. And so, like I said, if I say any more, I will spoil it, but everyone should go pick up a copy of Spring Snow right now. If you guys have not seen Paul Schrader's movie, Mishima, A Life in Four Chapters, everyone needs to get that immediately. It's on Criterion, torrent it, do whatever you need to do, but it is one of the more beautiful movies of all time, and it is for sure the best movie on an author and about writing ever. And the movie is showing how Mishima's personal life influenced his novels. So we're getting kind of this biopic, lens, but then we're transitioning to surreal movie sets that depict his books. And it's absolutely amazing. George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola produced this. Philip Glass did the score. Paul Schrader, who wrote Taxi Driver and Raging Bull and other classics, was the director. If you look down the list that people working on this, from costume designers to everyone else, like some of the best in the industry. And so I highly recommend you guys see this movie. If you haven't read Mishima, or if you have, this is a must see. And that should get you into the series. And it covers in there book number 2 of the Sea of Fertility tetralogy, which should encourage you to get into it all. So next on the list is Infinite Jest, and this is the second time I've been reading it with the group, and we are breaking this up over the entire summer. We are doing an infinite summer. So we did about the first 250 pages, and if you guys know Infinite Jest, that takes you more than a normal book to read. And so I've talked about Infinite Jest on this channel plenty of times, but for people who don't know, this novel is one of the best transformative novels of the past 30 years, I would say, 30 or 40 years. It is hard. There are different elements that don't work. It is a long novel. It spans over 1,000 pages. But if you are sensitive, if you are open, if you have struggled with depression, addiction, family trauma, addiction, really anything, pornography to sports, if you enjoy stories that are non-linear or have different fragmented elements that all come together or partially come together, then this novel is for you. I mean, there are a lot. It's become a trend to talk crap about David Foster Wallace online, but he is for sure a genius. Anyone that talks crap about him will never be able to write like him. There are countless authors who have tried to be him, but it's sad that he died so early. I feel like many authors don't peak until their 40s and 50s, and probably if he would have lived and died in his 80s or 90s, we would have looked back at this at like an early novel that would have led up to other masterpieces. And so this is a book that requires you to commit to finish. If you pick this up, understand that it's going to be hard. That's why I'm building a course on this book. It's not an easy course to do. The course is already up to 12 hours or something, and it's only a third of the way through the book. It's going to take you near dozens of hours, probably over somewhere between 30 and 50 hours of reading to finish. but you will be a better reader and a better human being, in my opinion, if you finish Infinite Jest. And if you guys want to join the book club, you are not far enough behind yet to not be able to catch up without killing yourself. Last year, we were at the end of the novel in the book club, like last meeting, and there was some dude, and I was like, we're 900 pages in, man. I don't think you can catch up. And like, people are weird. I'm weird too. I would do this. He was like, challenge accepted. And he read like 10 hours a day for a week to catch up to us. Next, we read The Crying Law of 49 by Thomas Pynchon. And we are reading through all of Thomas Pynchon's books in 2025 and 2026. And I believe that this is the best intro to Pynchon. It's only 150 pages, but it's dense. It's hard. There are books like Inherent Vice by Pynchon that are a little bit easier, if anyone saw the movie, to read. But this one gets you in the mentality and prepares you for what's coming later. Novels like Mason and Dixon, Gravity's Rainbow, Against the Day, they are much more complex and they span near 1,000 pages. And so this was our training ground. The Crying Law of 49 is about a woman named Oedipa who learns of her lover's death and she becomes the executor of his will. But this dude is like a powerful rich dude. And so she kind of gets drawn into this web of conspiracies where she's looking to crack the conspiracy of Trastero, and this muted horn symbol is appearing everywhere, and she just gets drug into this land of conspiracy. And it has a beautiful commentary, in my opinion, one of the best, on communication and how modern society and mass media prevent us from making good communication patterns, because most people don't realize that the way we speak, the way we act most of the time are simulacras, that our behaviors, and this is very Girardian, our desires, our behaviors are just mimicking others. And Pynchon kind of focuses on this and shows how characters model what they are seeing in media or on the radio or on TV, and he does it in a very genius way. Actually, Infinite Jest has a lot of this too. I think that any modern novel that is focusing on anything to do with technology and communication has to talk about that, how we're basically not original anymore, that we're stuck in this hyper reality of infinite information and programming that is happening. And so the muted horn symbol, when she first finds it, this isn't really a spoiler, it has the name Waste on it, but she starts diving into this conspiracy of this mail company, which is like the classic form of communication. And there's so much layered contrast and so many beautiful things happening in the novel that I highly recommend it for everyone. If you have not read Thomas Pynchon yet, him and Don DeLillo, among others, are the best living novelists for sure. And the Pynchon, has a novel coming out this September or October, if I remember correctly, October 7th, actually, named Shadow Ticket, that I made a video about, and everyone should be prepared for it. There may be a time in the coming years, if the literary renaissance, right conscious, let's go everybody, if it doesn't happen, book launches for literary fiction aren't going to exist anymore. Luckily, I got to live through The Road being launched by Cormac McCarthy, and also The Passenger and Stella Maris. I've lived through a couple Murakami launches, some DeLillo launches, and it feels awesome to go to the store and buy a book from someone who is a great author. And McCarthy and Pynchon and DeLillo, at some level in the latter stages of their career, haven't written as good of works as Blood Meridian or Suttree and Underworld and Gravity's Rainbow or Mason and Dixon or whatever. But nonetheless, it still feels awesome. And like I said, that may disappear soon, because who's our literary superstar right now? Who are we all going to show up for? We don't have any celebrities. They're all old. We haven't created one. The last one that existed was David Foster Wallace. If The Pale King came out and was a success, and he waited 15 years to do another book, but was doing podcasts, was on Joe Rogan, all the other big ones, because of course they'd want him and he'd do great at them, and he did this big book launch, it would be huge. We've never had in the literary fiction community in the modern world a launch that was as big as like Twilight, that had people lining up, that had people excited. And I don't know why we can't. We have a reader base. You're watching this, and millions of people just in America alone are fans of literary fiction and real fiction. We just haven't had someone who's good step up to the plate yet and figure it out, and that's the message of this channel. So The Crying Law of 49, highly recommended by me. I could go on and on about the themes. I am going to do that over on the Substack, but I don't want to bore you guys because I'm going to have to spoil it if I want to go any further. All right, the next book that I read, and these are all kind of loosely in order, I usually read anywhere from 3 to 7 or 8 books at once, was Cities of the Plain by Cormac McCarthy. And this is the final final book of his Border trilogy, which I think may be one of the greatest book series of all time. People are honestly, I think people are fucking dumb. Like people that hate on Cormac McCarthy maybe read The Road or something, but I cannot fathom how you could think that he is not a good writer, that he can't write. And I mean, the sentences and the things he does. Go read the Border trilogy right now. And maybe I am super close-minded, but I don't. I think that if you don't see what he's doing there, that you have a logical stick up your ass, just to say it bluntly, that you have no connection to nature, that you have no connection to the sentimental, to the old world, to the primordial. Like you are just that may be because, like I said, logic, or you're too religious, or you've never experienced that before. I don't know. But if you have opened yourself up to that world, which is the raw world, which is the actual world, not the world of simulacra, I don't know one author. I could talk about some classic authors, but they're so far back that there is a division. I could talk about Moby Dick writing like this, and Herman Melville writing like this. But Cormac McCarthy was that person. And like I love all these other modern authors, and like I said, they can write beautiful stories and beautiful sentences, but I don't know any of them that can tap into the mythopoetic voice and a highly stylized voice all at once. I mean, Larry McMurtry can't do it. Love him to death. Love the Westerns. Philip Meyer, love The Sun. Butcher's Crossing. I mean, I could just go on and on about authors that just are good, great, legends. They can't do it though. They can't write the lines that are in this book. They can't write the epilogue. Go read All the Pretty Horses and see how he talks about horses, see how he brings up dream sequences. Like I think a lot of the time, and I had to read Cormac multiple times, people are just missing what is going on. People are just blowing through it and they don't understand. Because right now, my wife and I are, we have a 6-month-old daughter right now, and we just read books to her. We just read books to each other. We have multiple books going on right now. So we're reading the Border trilogy to her right now, and we'll continue on. Someone the other day left a comment. I reposted something saying something similar, that you should read your kids Hemingway and Shakespeare. And someone was like, it's borderline child abuse to read your kid Hemingway. And it's like, what? Hemingway is pretty soft core, honestly. And I love that comment because we're willing to indoctrinate, just throw a screen in front of our kids. We're willing to send them off to public school with kids that bully them and say crazy shit to them, and teachers that don't care about them. We're willing to expose them to toxic family members and toxic people. We're willing to indoctrinate them into religions that they may want to break out of later and will have religious trauma. We're willing to do all of that, but we can't tell them stories. We can't read them things. Anyway, the resistance is crazy. But, because I've been slowing down and reading it out loud, which is awesome to do, but if you do it by yourself, I actually wrote Blood Meridian by hand. And I know a couple others who watch the channel did it when I recommended that. But when you write a book by hand, or when you read it out loud yourself, and I do this a lot as a teacher, you really start to understand it more. And when you hear someone actually, like my wife reads a lot of the time, and hearing her read it, someone you love, not some audiobook, not William Hertz or some random ass person reading to you, it actually is even better and more fun. But diving into that, it's really good stuff. So the Border trilogy and Cities of the Plain is about two different boys. Book 1 and Book 2 deal with separate protagonists that eventually meet up in the third novel. It takes place in the Southwest in the 1940s, and then the last book takes place in the early 1950s. Really good stuff. It is a inverted coming-of-age novel with Quixotean and Arthurian romance angles, but with all the darkness of Cormac McCarthy. And this is how reality functions. If you step outside the lines and confront the world, a lot of the time it is not a pretty place. I moved to Oregon when I was 19 to start a ski company with my best friend, and we were wild. We were chasing this romantic dream, and my friend ended up dying in a ski accident. During backcountry skiing, he fell, got separated from so many of those people die or end up in traumatic circumstances, because when you combine youth with poverty, going out to the fringes of society, confronting nature, extreme idealism, arrogance, all the most beautiful parts of youth, and you combine them all together, people don't make it through that at a rate I'm really comfortable with. And Cormac writes from his heart in this entire Border trilogy, and I think is functioning at his peak, because everybody loves Blood Meridian, right? Like Blood Meridian, bro, or Cetri, and called those two his masterpieces. But he was not very far removed from those when he started writing these. He had already written the screenplay for Cities of the Plain before he had even started or really got going with Blood Meridian, which came out about 12 years earlier than this book. And everyone loves Blood Meridian because it's cowboys and Indians. Judge Holden is this transcendent figure, and Cormac is writing in this primordial voice that we've never heard before, at least in the modern context. We've had to wait, since Faulkner, since Melville, since Whitman, for someone to be able to do that. But when Cormac confronts all the pretty horses, if we believe, which I do, at least the basic facts, that Cormac was involved with Augusta Britt, his underage muse, and was really on this ego trip while at the same time confronting his old age and these things. When people reach their 40s and 50s, many authors look back and write these nostalgic novels, write these sensitive novels. And the Border Trilogy features some of the only love stories and legitimate love stories and not so legitimate love stories of Cormac McCarthy's entire bibliography. What love stories are there? Rinthi and Cola Holm, who are brother and sister in Outer Dark. Alicia Western and Bobby Western, who are brother and sister. Suttree and the Prostitute. Like, I could go on, but most of them are broken relationships. And seeing Cormac touch on love and want to write beautifully, want to be sensitive, write about horses in a way I haven't heard many authors ever write about animals is unforgettable stuff, honestly. And so I recommend everybody go check out the Border Trilogy. You can start with either The Crossing or All the Pretty Horses, doesn't really matter, but why not start with All the Pretty Horses? If there's one book from today's list that I'm going to ask you to read, it is that. I feel it in my heart right now that whoever is listening to this will get something out of it. And just trust me. If you're watching this, hopefully we've developed that trust between each other. And so, moving forward, and I will say that at the end of Cities of the Plain, really fast, and this won't spoil anything, Cormac goes into God. I mean, throughout the entire series, Cormac not only explores love at the deepest level he does throughout his career, but also God, spirituality, life after death, nature, these types of things. It is turned up to a maximum in these novels. And in Cities of the Plain, spirituality and the contemplation of his own creativity, like there's metafictional elements, breaking of the fourth wall. There's a lot of stuff that he doesn't do maybe outside of The Passenger or Whales and Men, which is an unpublished screenplay, in Cities of the Plain. And so it's worth it to get there. And so, of course, next on the list, we have none other than Ernest Hemingway, someone who I'm going to be talking about a lot on this channel. And what's funny is that my wife actually just read this book. She keeps up with a lot of stuff that I read for the book club and is obviously ticking off classics off of her list. But, she said after reading this, and she has read some of the Nick Adams stories, but I don't think she's read an entire Hemingway novel. She was like, why is he writing like Pooh Bear? And many people, one of my friends over on the book club, Titus, he said of that compared to a lot of the other novels that we are reading, or I'm talking about, he reads most of them. He says that The Sun Also Rises is pure amateurism compared to this, which I thought was funny. But Hemingway is an interesting guy in the sense that to read Hemingway and understand him, I think, requires you to be in a certain mentality. One of those is more of the malignant masculine form of consciousness that only cares about fighting, drinking, womanizing. I love when I have commenters, a lot of men watch this channel. I would say at least 80% of this channel are men. When I say the words malignant masculine or toxic masculinity, people get triggered. People think this is like a Gillette commercial. Like, I understand completely that there has been an attack on masculinity. That is one of the more horrific things that have happened. But to think that Hemingway's masculinity, the masculinity of old, is appropriate in 2025 after supposedly 100 years of evolution is insane. Just like thinking that the Kardashians or whoever, who are the quote unquote pinnacles of femininity, at least in consensual reality, that they are the highest evolution of women, that Andrew Tate or an unconscious grease monkey or some asshole jerk at the bar, that those dudes are real men. Those dudes are, that is toxic, just as the Kardashians are, gender on display. Testosterone can go astray. Look back at history for countless examples. Look at domestic violence. Look at any of these things and it's obvious. We are barely out of the dark ages, everybody. I don't even know if we are yet. We haven't hit this utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill, Voltaire, higher consciousness as a collective level even at a modicum yet. And this is coming from someone who isn't perfect and is weak in many different ways. Anyway, so I feel like people who, to enjoy Hemingway means that you have to be sympathetic, and it's okay to be sympathetic. I'm sympathetic to this lifestyle and this point of view of these traumatized World War I veterans who are this lost generation. Like, that's fine. And it's fine to be sympathetic to how we once were. That doesn't matter. But there's people who resonate with this. And idolize it because they want it. They want to go back to these simpler times. So those people can appreciate the novel. And the other people who can appreciate Hemingway and The Sun Also Rises are thinkers, readers who can feel, who don't look at the text blankly, but are willing to interpret what's happening on the page in an irrational way. I've said many times before that I've been to many different conferences on authors. I've been to a Rene Girard concert, Landé conference. I've been to Cormac McCarthy conference. I've been to like more literary conferences at large where many different types of papers are being presented. I've been to philosophy conferences. But when I went to the Hemingway concert up in Cook City, Montana, and Cody, Wyoming, and all the places that Hemingway was at up there, it was the wackiest group of people I've ever met. Normal guys, basically, in terms of when we went out for lunch or we went and saw Hemingway's old cabin. You can't go to it, but you can look at it. It's on a property now. But as a group, the presentations that they come up with, the theories that they have on Hemingway's stories are more schizo than everyone else combined. And the Cormac McCarthy people are weird. The Girardians are weird. Like, a lot of literary people are weird because your job as an academic is to just sit there and synthesize information. For instance, what I brought to that conference was a synthesis of Ernest Hemingway's work with Schelling, the German idealist Schelling. And I wrote a paper, yada, yada, yada. But I was an amateur at that point. I was, in my mid-20s. I think it still is a good paper and yada, yada, yada. But there were dudes who had been there studying Hemingway for 3 decades, and they were in deep on one topic. So they figured out something, that there was a connection, or that, Schelling and Hemingway work well. And they've been working on that idea for decades, thinking about it, reading every text multiple times, finding symbols that resonate with it. Wild stuff. But it made reading Hemingway the most exhilarating experience ever. I was already doing it with the text. I knew there was something more going on when I first read it. So the people that can't read Hemingway are logical individuals. Individuals that there's 2 types of people. People who just can't stand, these more overt masculine novels, and think it's just all misogynistic and can't see the undercurrent, or people who are way too logical. I've known a lot of people who have read this, and the only ones that dislike it are in those 2 groups. Because when you project logic onto this, it is Pooh Bear writing. It isn't that great of writing. And people who are successful reading Hemingway, in my opinion, are people who are creative, but also people who maybe look into his biography and what happened with his mom and in the war. If you go see the Ken Burns documentary, you'll get basically everything you need. And that information about the lost generation and what Hemingway went through, I think will arm you to really dive into his works seriously. And so The Sun Also Rises is interesting because it's Hemingway's one of his only major novels that is written in the first person. And it's a brilliant strategy because one of the characters in this, Jake Barnes, is impotent. He can't have sex from seemingly a wound from the war. He's this Fisher King type guy. And this novel is a field guide to Barnes trying to use different modalities, bullfighting, womanization, fishing, boxing, many different things, as a way to reinitiate himself into masculinity after he feels like he's lost it. This is a major theme for many post-World War II novels. One of the best Native American fiction novels of all time, Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. Everybody should go read that. It's one of the best writers, one of the best books in the American canon, and for sure, in terms of female writers, one of the best novels published, or I should say, women writers. Sorry. But that novel deals with someone named Tayo who is traumatized from the Pacific Theater, and he comes back, and his tribe, the Laguna Pueblo, try to reinitiate him through the old ways. They try to heal him how they would used to heal warriors from the 19th century and before, and it's not working on him. He's still getting drunk and being abusive and still being this terrible person. So the novel's about him finding a shaman who tells him that you have to find a new ceremony. You need to find a new medicine, a new way of healing. And, it's this kind of novel. And so many of these post-World War novels are about this individuation journey. And so when you look at Hemingway from the lens of a trauma narrative, it starts getting really good. You really start to feel what it's about. You start to see that Hemingway, through Barnes and his other characters, is doing a form of narrative repair, not just for them, but for us. And because it's in the first person, and because many of these characters are stunted psychologically and stuck and frozen in trauma, that combined with a lack of narration, and this is something that Cormac McCarthy took from Hemingway, creates this crystallized iceberg theory that's fire. Because when we look at many of the authors, I just talked about Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. When you read their novels, their characters, if you look at Raskolnikov or The Underground Man, many characters, and this is why they kind of are, especially Dostoevsky's characters are critiqued. They are they're prophetic voice. They're beautiful, genius, but somewhat unrealistic, and feel like they are meant to be in a novel, feel like Dostoevsky is preaching to us and creating these grand things. And so Hemingway subverts all of that and cuts away all narration by removing the interiority and making a character who's impotent. And so, speaking of Dostoevsky, the next novel that I read, which was a reread, was Crime and Punishment. And this one, much more so than Notes from the Underground, is prophetic. It follows Raskolnikov, who is this dropout law student who has decided to intellectually and emotionally isolate himself in St. Petersburg and descend into poverty. And while in this kind of isolation, he comes up or gets attached to this idea of the extraordinary man, and that people like Napoleon, and Hitler didn't exist yet, but Hitler or whoever, because of their greatness, have the right to commit atrocities, especially if it benefits humanity. And this is where many people are at. This is where many thinkers end up, because this is where moral relativism a lot of the time leads. This is something that I noticed with, while attending university. I would try to talk to people about objective morality. Oh, it doesn't exist. Oh, no. And people would lose their brain. But then I would say, so then it's okay at times to kill people and do this. And if you talk to many people who have this utopia project in mind, especially one that's based on control and manipulation and social engineering of the population, they will tell you that, yeah, we're going to have to kill a lot of people to make this happen. And that's just common sense. That to create an empire, a control system, one global government, whatever, a lot of people aren't going to want to go along with that. And I also understand that to create an anarchist society, or to create a society where we're all autonomous and don't need people who we vote for that have moral authority over us because we can't rule ourselves, I also understand that there would obviously have to be a great reset in that direction. But at least that would be working towards something realistic. But I knew so many people who had to shift into moral relativism to fit their politics. And if you look at the modern political landscape, no matter what side you believe in, you basically have to do that. You can't believe in objective morality and go and vote for politicians that are servants of the military industrial complex and will go topple countries or go pay for, supply aid to go kill people in conflicts that don't matter to us. And so Raskolnikov has this extraordinary man theory in his mind. He has this moral relativistic view, which, like I said, so many people fall into, because when you are isolated and start to overthink, a lot of the time you either project yourself toward these figures, in our world, parasocial relationships, and in Raskolnikov's world too, thinking of Napoleon, or you get on utopia projects. You get behind a party, you get behind a group, you join the collective, or project your focus onto an individual. And it's funny to see people, as an online figure myself, to have people do this to me. People who, I've had people treat me and like I'm some, or I should say, I become to them the biggest figure of influence in their life, which is awesome, and I hope I'm being positive. But then, because they've built me up, they'll watch, I have like 600 videos. They'll go watch my videos from years ago and maybe hear opinions or whatever from me that I don't maybe talk about as much anymore, just for whatever reason, that they're just shocked by, and they lose all faith. They're like, I can't believe this. Why would you do this? And it's because we're so isolated that we put our faith into these parasocial relationships, into these people who are doing what we want to be doing, and yada, yada, yada. which is okay when it's done in a healthy way. There are plenty of people who I idolize and model and like have lift me up and I become somewhat obsessed with, and like it's whatever. But most people aren't choosing, not to build myself up, someone like me to idolize. They are choosing Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, Bill Maher, Joe Rogan, Bernie Sanders. Like I can name people from the left and the right side of the aisle. And all those people I just named and many others, they are state media. They are connected to the state, to the military industrial complex or corporations or whoever. And at some level are voices and enablers of them. And that's why they've been elevated to the position that they are in. Because if we had a true revolutionary voice that was trying to reform our country, the corporations and everyone else would have them canceled and shipped away before they were ever able to reach that point. If there was an Andrew Tate who had that same energy, who had that same drive, but instead of his message, it was a message of love and unity, but he did a lot of the same things, he would be in a Romanian prison for life. He wouldn't be wandering around. But the only reason someone like Andrew Tate was able to be elevated was because people are isolated, depressed, and want to tap back into the primal instincts. They want to, as I was talking about earlier in this video with Hemingway, go romanticize the toxic aspects of masculinity. They don't realize that there are martial artists who are at peace and exuberant individuals, but love everyone and want to lift everybody up. And so anyway, so Raskolnikov is embedded in this extraordinary man theory, and he wants to test this idea that he is one of these superior individuals. He believes that there are these superior individuals and not, and that he wants to be a part of that group, and he thinks he's a part of that group, so he's going to start committing crimes, murdering people. But, and small spoiler here, it doesn't work out, obviously. He can't handle it, and that's the story, The murder isn't the story. It's how he copes with it and realizes that he wasn't one of these individuals. And I think this is true for many people. Like when push comes to shove, being an asshole, being a jerk, like actually stepping into some of these roles that are more malignant doesn't feel good, and it doesn't feel aligned, especially if you have a moral compass. And so the writing here is insane. Dostoevsky just goes crazy. The book can be a bit slow. The first couple parts always, at least in my opinion, are slow. But if you work through it, then you're going to have some beautiful revelations about crime. Because when it comes to laws, you can't understand them through logic or legal definitions. You have to go deeper into them, into something that we would maybe call philosophy or revelation. And this is moving toward objective morality, that we could look at laws, and those are the objective laws, books of law, Black's Law. We can sit and read all the legalese and find out all the definitions, and we read Webster's 1828 and figure out how we're, controlled by words and do all of that. But what's deeper than that? Why? What is truly wrong? And Hegel says, quote, "The hidden essence of the universe does not carry a force capable of withstanding the daring of knowledge. It must reveal itself to man." And so in this novel, crime is not just a rational category. It's not just something that is done. Like we see statistics, like there were 800 murders in Chicago or whatever, and we're just like, okay. This novel makes crime metaphysical, It helps it connect to the essence of the universe. And you can't find that through logic. Augustine said, "If they do not ask about the meanings of particular concepts, I know what is being discussed. If they ask me to explain their essence to others, I'm incapable of doing that." And so this book makes us ask, what is crime? What is evil? Why do we hurt each other? What is justice? And when we talk about crime or like these things, we're not talking about someone broke the rules. Oh, Johnny was a bad guy and broke the rules. We're not talking about words on a police report or, that the judge is saying. It's something that is in our soul. It's the spiritual rupture that happens when somebody violates your natural rights. And so, I'm really into ethics and talking about this stuff. I won't drill that into you guys here. Like I said, I already know that believing in objective morality, which is the only way to create a more nonviolent society. If it's real or not, we have to believe it's real. I know that's radical and people don't want to get down with that, because if you do, then we'd have to dismantle every single aspect of not just our society, but how we treat others, our own family, and many other things. But moving on to the next book. I read The Sibling Society by Robert Bly, and this is a mixture of nonfiction and poetry and kind of social commentary. Robert Bly is the most influential American poet probably ever. People talk about Walt Whitman and many others, but Robert Bly not only won the National Book Award for poetry and was one of the best American poets of all time, and I've made many videos of him on the channel. This is a reread. I actually made a 4.5 hour video on the Sibling Society that's available if you guys would like to go and watch it. And I actually only read this book because I had to go back to my hometown and take care of some stuff with my family, and I forgot to bring books. And so then I had to fly home and I had this layover and I was looking around. I was like, dude, there are no books here. And that was one of the ones I had left from over a decade ago from when I lived there. There was a copy still there. I was like, you know what? I'm going to read this. So in this huge trip I had to take through 2 different airports, I blew through this. And anyway, Robert Bly, the only reason we know about people like Pablo Neruda and so many other authors is because Robert Bly translated them and elevated them. This entire channel is a dedication to Robert Bly and his mission and what he was doing. Harold Bloom a little bit too, but I feel like even more so Robert Bly. I'm trying to be the 2.0 version of him. He is someone that I model and think about all the time. But the Sibling Society talks about, as I was talking about earlier, that masculinity is in crisis, that femininity is in crisis, and that we are living in adolescent brains, that most individuals out there, if you talk to them, are in a state of adolescence. They've had no individuation, no growth, no rites of ritual, and they are doing something called horizontal thinking and living. And so Bly talks about how real artists and real thinkers have access to ecstatic states and what we could define as more depressive states. I don't know how to say it, but going into the underworld, being able to ascend to the heights and being able to go down there. And they never look around horizontally. But many authors and artists and humans seek external validation. They want things, they want the house, they want these goals, and they look around them and what's going on. But if you are a writer and you look around at what other people are writing, like if you go to Gumroad or even Substack, as much as I love it, if you fall into the wrong, if you go to the autofiction section or something, or get in with that crowd, you're going to look around and you're going to be like, damn, I'm pretty fucking good. But if you don't look vertically and down and throughout the past and look to your elders and see what they wrote and look within and see what your heart is calling you to do, then you're never actually going to get good at writing, or you're never going to individuate. And one of the reasons that we've fallen into this trap is because we've kicked the elders out. We've sent our elders down to Phoenix or the retirement community. We have no rites of passage. Even if you are religious, baptism. I was baptized and went through various religious rites. They were somewhat effective, but they weren't that effective. Many of the boys who I went through church with, ended up, first of all, not continuing. Many of them were pieces of shit. One of them was like a serial rapist at our high school. The dude that would just take girls out, take them out to a nice dinner, be nice, and make out with them in the back seat and, just force it in. That was the most pious dude in my age group, the most active dude at our church. Those rituals were not working. And one of the reasons that is because we don't have this in any system of accountability. We have no connection to our family. Because the family has been broken. And in our public school system, we have no connection to older kids. Bly talks about how throughout time that if you were a 5-year-old, you'd be interacting with 1-year-olds up to 90-year-olds, that every single day for however long in human society, even until 100 years ago, you would be involved with your grandparents and elders and the younger kids. And in the one-room schoolhouse, you'd be with kids of all ages. And now we isolate kids in their grade. We let them be adolescents, and we send them to college where they're around people. Then we send them out into this workforce where they're just constantly he calls it flattened. And so poetry, art, individuation, nature, silence, creating new rituals, spirituality. These are the things that are meant to expand us. And this is actually one of the advantages that poetry and writing has. So if you guys don't know, right now I'm working on 3 different books. I'm working on a book called Desert Orpheus, which is mystical desert poetry with kind of with Greek mythology influencing it. And I'm also translating Rilke's sonnets to Orpheus in the book, and also doing a bunch of translations of Orphic invocations. Then I'm working on a book called Warm Mountain, where I'm translating the poet Cold Mountain's poems. And he is a Chinese wilderness poet from a millennia ago. And then I'm working on a bunch of translations from the Spanish modernist and symbolist tradition. I'm going to compile those into a book called probably like Mystical Spanish Poetry or something. But what I learned, and what's crazy, is that reading the poems of just a couple of the Chinese and Japanese poets, like for instance, Han Shan, aka Cold Mountain, I've learned more about how to view reality from them than almost all the Buddhist texts that I've read. I've read, as I said earlier, I have a yoga channel. I've read hundreds of books on Eastern philosophy. I've studied Sanskrit, dedicated so much of my life to it. But when you read good poetry, people like Basho or Han Shan, they're showing you how it looks like to see the world in that way. It's an automatic shortcut. They're showing you, like, I don't even know what the right analogy is, but I feel like all these Buddhist texts are like these crazy manuals that aren't the actual lived experience. And these guys just take all of that and they've meditated and done all that and then show you just how to see the world. And you could do that. I can look at their work and be like, okay, I'm going to start to try to do this. I'm going to try to see the world in this way. And it's not easy at first, but then you can. It's just like really great shortcut. The same is true with like a lot of the Spanish mystical poetry and a lot of stuff. I mean, you can say the same about novels, but that's what's really powerful about poetry, is that because everything is so condensed, that it can really help you see the world in a different way in a short amount of time. And that's why it's so powerful. And that's why it's really an untapped resource for the literary renaissance. This is why people like Rupi Kaur are so popular, that a lot of girls feel disenfranchised and they have these emotions and they don't know what to do with them and they've never been giving meaning. And Rupi creates a pathway for them that's easy for everybody to follow, easy for everyone to plug into, especially women, because they have that. But the same is true with like mystical experiences in nature. Like all of us, if we go out to nature and we let ourselves experience it over time, we will start to have and be able to resonate with experiences that are very Zen-like, very aware. And if you have a respect for it, and this is where the West really went away from it, because if you look at Genesis, there's a separation between humans and nature. And if you look at, eventually Descartes and the last 1,000 years of culture in the West, it's been about dominating and divorcing ourselves from nature and it being this terrible thing. But now we have the opportunity to be aware and not fall into these false, unnatural, dark dichotomies with nature and actually just be with it. And so that's what Bly is, one of the methodologies that he talks about in this work, that you can find these things. There are so many different avenues for poets to make an immediate impact, or writers, and we just aren't utilizing them. Like personal transformation can happen through writing, among many other things, but we're just seeing this word horizontally, and we don't want to do that. We don't want to be uplifted or see the malignant side of things. And so I highly recommend this book, or Iron John, any of Robert Bly's poetry books, his poetry compilations. I think you guys will get a lot out of them. So next I read Emma Jung and Mary Louise von Franz's The Grail Legend, which is a breakdown of the Holy Grail myth from a psychological and symbolic aspect. And, this is a dense book. This is very Jungian. Like, it wasn't even easy for me to read. And I want to talk about Carl Jung more on this channel, and I maybe should, but there was just like so many splintering interests. And like, is this, But speaking of kind of that divorce, the Grail myth in general, the Arthurian romances, were the last English texts, at least in my opinion, until there was a revival because of German Romanticism that bled into, all throughout the West, that was somewhat connected to nature, that had still symbolic ties to the natural world, to the actual symbolic world, not this kind of fabricated or simulacra world that we created involving Christianity, even if you believe it's true. Like, eventually, for hundreds of years, we got lost in this web. So this is just a deep dive into all the elements you've maybe heard me talk about before earlier, deep dives into the Fisher King, our self as the Holy Grail, and us trying to find inner unity and holiness, us trying to resolve paradoxes and the fragmentation in our own soul by having a transcendent center for all of them to flow through, flow to, and actually the healing of the male psyche, because in here, Parsifal has to ask the question, for whom does the Grail serve? And that question creates this shift from the ego to a relationship, from just this endless ambition, this male testosterone drive, to actually understanding, to actually feeling for others in a real empathetic way. And when we hear that, people are like, I feel, that's kind of one of the responses I've noticed when talking to men and like dealing with a lot of this stuff is that all of us feel emotions, right? And so when someone says you're not feeling emotions, it's not that you there. I mean, there are some people I know who like I don't think feel anything, but there are others, and I'm sure they've thought about it or heard this before, and you don't feel, and it's because much of your life is blinded by ambition. That to actually feel, you have to be open and very receptive. And feeling and understanding is something that can heal, but ambition a lot of the time can only hurt because you can get stuff done without having to be ambitious. That's what Han Shan and the Chinese poets taught me. You guys may see that I post a lot and do a lot, but I'm like not very ambitious. Like in general, I'm very go with the flow, don't like any friction, and I just stay in the flow and continuously do things all day. And I've been training myself for over a decade to separate from devices and any other thing that kicks me out of the flow, surrounding myself with my wife and a house and a job that helps keep me in the flow. So it just seems like I get a lot done and that I must be this ambitious person. But my actual goals are just to help more people, to get people to read more. Because I know if I wake up 10 million readers. Let's say I accomplish the goal and I create a literary renaissance. Shit, I'll have as much money as I'll need to live. You know what I mean? I won't have to work. I mean, if I do that, then people will want to help me. It's that simple. I don't need to have a metric like I need 5 million YouTube views a month so I could be full time. Like I don't think about that. I think, okay, how can I get the most amount of people to wake up? How can I do this or do that? And then the center of that and the way I'm more successful at that is, okay, not how can I get more video views, but how can I connect with people more? How can I make people feel more and feel confident and feel like they have someone who cares about them and knows what they're going through? Because I know what almost all of you guys are going through because I went through it myself and I've talked to hundreds of you guys and I'm trying to be a voice for you guys. And so anyway, it starts with feeling. And there are times I fall off the track, you guys. There are times when I sit, like when I was beefing with the Cormac McCarthy subreddit, that was my ego. Just like, you know what, fuck you guys. I'm going to troll. I'm going to use my group of people here just to go mess with you guys. Like, like I'm not perfect in that sense either. And I have my quibbles. But Emma Jung and Mary Louise von Franz, this is a life's work. This is a deep dive into alchemical symbolism. This is, it's a very deep look and almost a logical way. Like it really will just convince you about care with a capital C, truth with a capital T, that those exist and those need to be the great work that you are embarking on to not just live it, but share it with others. And so everyone, those are the 12 books I read. I read various articles and little poetry books and stuff, but I don't need to talk about those. If you want to know how I can get all this done, I just dedicate hours to reading a day. Just make sure that I get it done. If you look, this month, this was about 3 books a week, but I read about 3 hours a day. That's 20 hours a week. And so for most of these, like the Grail Legend, this one probably took me about 15 hours, but there were other books this month that only took me like an hour or 2 hours. And so in the long run, most of it balances out to 5 to 6 hours on average to read a book. And then there's the occasional 30-hour book. And so thinking about it like that if you dedicate 8 hours a week or 10 hours a week to reading, you will easily get over 100 books a year. Then 10 years from now, you will have read 1,000 books, which is huge. That means that you will have read the bibliography of at least 40 authors that you love, that you think are important, and then hundreds of other scattered books in various genres. And that will be more than enough knowledge for you to, change the world with, because we're not just here to consume knowledge. We're not here to really figure out about the mysteries of the universe because they don't exist. You're never going to figure them out. You're here to figure out how to answer the question, for whom does the Grail serve? And so thank you guys for being here. Thank you for the support. If you guys want to support me, there are going to be countless videos on this channel for free. There are videos for free on my Substack, or if you want to become a paid subscriber and help me out, then that would be great. I am trying to make it a reality over the next couple of years to become a full-time content creator. It's probably going to take a while, but if you would like to help me out in that slow process, I would be more than grateful, and I will see you guys in the next video.